Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Betsy Hill. I'm President and Chief Operating Officer of the BrainWare Company. It's time to get started with our webinar this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we're getting started. First of all, it looks like several of you have found the chat window, which is good because that is the way that you can ask questions during our webinar today. I'm also going to try to prompt a little bit of discussion in a couple of sections of the presentation. So whatever thoughts you have at that time, I hope you'll share them with others using the chat window. We are recording the session today, and so it will be available later if you want to watch it again or want to share it with colleagues or something like that. If you would like a certificate of participation today for professional development purposes, just type a note into the chat window again, just saying certificate or something like that, and we'll be happy to do that and process that afterwards. If you are participating via a smartphone and would like a certificate, please also make sure you include your email address in your copy, in your chat entry, because sometimes the system doesn't get you attached to that. I've also mentioned a couple of times, but I want to mention again that the handouts for today, or behind the handouts tab, you can download a copy of the slides that I'll be using today. So without further ado, let us get started. So this is our agenda for today. It's not a typical bullet point agenda, but it really represents what we're going to be talking about. And of course, all of our classrooms are filled with brains, each of which has developed uniquely and in its own way. And then we also have to recognize that the teacher has a brain. And we're going to be really looking at a little more deeply into the process of learning and what that means, and what some implications are for dealing with some of our students. So the first question I'm going to pose to you, and again, I really encourage you to chat any thoughts that you have or enter any ideas or responses that you'd like to share into the chat window. So the first question, of course, is going to ask a really basic one, which is, what is learning? So I'm going to see if anybody has any answers. That often when I ask this question in a group of educators, learning seems like such an obvious thing to us. Sometimes I hear, well, it's about acquiring knowledge, or it's about being able to do things we couldn't do before. And all of those are true, acquiring new information, says Andrea. Thanks for sharing that. And it is, but at a more basic level, in fact, at a biological level, learning is actually the act of making and strengthening connections between thousands of neurons forming neural networks or maps. And that does enable us then to acquire knowledge and to apply it and to have other people observe it. But the actual process of learning is simply about the connections among neurons in our brains. And then our ability to retrieve that, which we call memory, is the ability to reconstruct or reactivate those previously made connections. And in fact, when the neuroscientists talk about this, they have a saying that neurons that fire together wire together. So the more that we activate a particular set of neurons that represent learning, that represent something we've been exposed to in the outside world, the stronger those connections get. That's why we refer to wiring together, and allows us to retrieve that information more easily. So just a little reminder of what our neurons look like. Obviously, they're much, much smaller than this. You could fit thousands of them on the head of a pin, maybe hundreds of thousands. But anyway, we have about 100 billion of them in our brains when we were born. We keep them, and that's pretty much all we're going to have for our lifetimes, with a couple of small exceptions. And what you're seeing here is the cell body. Each neuron has one axon, which it uses to communicate information and connect to the dendrites which are all of those other connections on the body of the neuron. And the connections are a combination of chemical and electric information transmission. So just as a reminder, this is what's happening. We're growing those connections. What we're going to look at next are two slides of actual neurons. And you can see the cell body, that's the darker sort of circular part, and then you can see the connections that start to sprout from them, the axons and the dendrites. The one on the left is a picture of neurons in the brain of a newborn baby, and the ones on the right are from the brain of a 2-year-old. And obviously, you can see that there are many, 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 many more connections between the neurons in the 2-year-old's brain. In fact, as our brains get bigger after we're born and eventually become to be about 90% of their adult size by the time we're about 7, the gain, the mass and the weight that is being developed there is not actually as a result of more neurons. We don't grow more neurons in general. It's about those connections, and it's about that mass of connections. And in fact, it turns out that the brain of the 2-year-old, and this is really a picture of learning. So what has happened from birth to 2 is a whole lot of learning and the development of a whole lot of neural connections. And in fact, the 2-year-old's brain actually has too many connections. And this is what the terrible twos looks like from a brain standpoint. And in fact, what the brain will start to do from 2 years on is to get rid of some of those connections and to streamline the ones that are the most important. So this is really a picture of learning. Now we're going to do a little memory experiment. And what I'm going to do is ask you to look at these words for a short time. I'll give you not too long. And I want you to see if you can, how many of them you can memorize in a short period of time. So I'm going to not talk too much so you can concentrate on the list of words. Okay, so now what I ask you to do is to see how many of them you can remember. So you can write them down. You don't have to chat them. Just write down for yourself some of the words that you can remember from that list. So you probably need another few moments to do this. But you can, as you're doing it, start to count up how many words you were able to remember. The list contained 15 words. It is unlikely that somebody remembered all of them, but hopefully you remembered 7 or 8 or 10 maybe. That would be pretty good because I didn't give you a very long time to try to learn them. And, oh, good, Sarah got 7. That's great. And then my other question is, did anybody write down the word sleep? Anybody write down the word sleep? Okay, we have 1. No, yes. So at least a few people did, and that's typically what happens. But in fact, the word sleep was not on the list because I'm going to go back to the list right here. But all of these relate to the concept of sleep. And so it's a great example of what happens in our minds when we build these neural networks. The words and the concepts around sleep are all wired together in our brain so that when we activate that area of the brain using one of the words like doze and slumber and snore and nap, we are more likely to actually activate the word sleep as well. And so connecting, yeah, Susan did great, 11. Wow, that's terrific. The point being that when we're learning, we're connecting new things to what we already know. We're building those and strengthening those neural networks. And so when we remember something, we're actually even though you didn't see the word sleep, it came up because it's related to these other things and closely connected in concepts. So let's talk a little bit about how information does get into our brains. So this is sort of a simple model. Again, this is not a picture of how things are wired in our brains, but it's a conceptual model that helps us focus a little bit on what we're doing. So we take in information through our senses, and we hold it for a short period of time in sensory memory. That is a short-term activation of those neurons where the information is coming in. But we actually have to discard most of the information that we're exposed to. The estimates are that we only take in about 10% of the information that is available to our senses in the environment. And of course, that is determined by the functioning of our attention processes. There's a part of the brain called the reticular activating system. Not really important to know what it's called. And yeah, we could spend a lot of time talking about amygdala processes, but the amygdala, among others, is what is which is where part of the limbic system and what determines how we're going to react to something emotionally. So the emotional content of something is very important. So all of that determines the amount of attention that we're going to pay and therefore what's going to get in. Then the information, if it's important, and our brains decided we need to think about it some more, we'll go into working memory, and we'll talk about each of these stages in a little bit more depth. But this is where we have to rehearse information in order to be able to get it into long-term memory. And if it's not transferred, so if it doesn't get through our attention filters, there's no hope of it getting into long-term memory. And likewise, if we don't get it into working memory and rehearse it, it's got no hope of getting into long-term memory. So what are you paying attention to right now? And here are your choices: the presenter, the clock, your hungry stomach, or the pygmy in the corner of the room. And probably, since you're in your office or maybe at home or wherever you happen to be, you may have been pretty confident there wasn't a pygmy in the corner of the room for you to turn around and look back at. But in fact, that would be highly unusual. And our attention processes are designed to detect things that are threatening or very novel or that have to do with our survival. So those are the things that we're going to pay attention to first. And as one of our participants suggested a little while ago, in fact, the amygdala is going to be active there and probably determine what's going to be a subject of attention. Now, there are several different kinds of attention. So we think about attention as focus, but in fact, it has a bunch of different aspects that we probably want to keep in mind. So sustained attention is what we often think about. We think about our students' ability to focus on the task at hand for a period of time. But there's also a part of attention that is about selecting what to pay attention to and screening out things that are not relevant. Divided attention is how quickly we can go back and forth, whether we can keep two sets of information or processes active. And then flexible attention is how smoothly we can shift from one thing to the next. So all of these are aspects of attention that may be important, and particularly in our classrooms with our students. But of course, we know that everybody doesn't have strong attention skills. In fact, I have yet to meet a teacher who thought that all of her students or his students were actually had good attention skills. So many times they don't. So what do we do when students don't have good attention skills? And again, I invite you to enter something into the chat window. If you have a student who may be diagnosed as ADD or ADHD, or simply doesn't have that diagnosis, but has some attention problems. So Andrea's suggesting we cue cards, nonverbal cues, right? We specifically try to direct their attention, making lists. That could also be helpful because then If they're not paying attention to everything, they can capture that in the list. Using the student's name in the lesson, right? We all respond to our names, so that will be a way to highlight and bring their attention back to the task at hand. Sometimes people talk about moving them away from distractions. So there are lots of ways that we try to help students compensate for sleep, exercise, and novelty. Very, very good. Those are all really important. Turns out that sleep is a huge determinant of our cognitive functioning in general, but certainly will impact attention. Exercise, in fact, when you're standing up, you have about 10% more oxygen going to your brain than if you're sitting down. So getting them up and moving around can be helpful. So lots of ways, but all really generally about helping them compensate for their weaker attention skills. So back to our little chart, our little diagram again. And what we want to focus on now, pun intended, I guess, is the process of working memory. So working memory, and it sounds like this is a pretty educated group based on your input and your in the chat window, which is absolutely fabulous. Of course, it's like our mental work table. It's our only conscious processing, and is something that actually I was going to do one other thing. Actually, what I want to focus on first is I sometimes do this and sometimes don't, but I think this is also a good one. So I actually want to look at those reception processes, the processes of getting information through our senses. And we don't often think about these, but in fact, these can also be filters or limitations on getting information into our brains to work on. Jan has asked about access to the PowerPoint, and in fact, I uploaded it into the handouts, and great, thanks, Greg. So you should be able to download it from there. I'm happy to send it if you aren't able to download it later, so just you'll have my contact information a little bit later. So let's talk about one aspect of vision, which is our visual span. Visual span refers to how much information we can take in at a glance. And what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an example. I'm going to show you a slide that has 6 boxes in it. And then I'm going to very quickly show you a slide where those boxes are filled in with letters. All of the boxes are going to be exactly the same, except for one box will be slightly different. So I'm going to try and do this pretty quickly. Here we go. Okay. Now, you don't need to type into your chat box which one it is, but I hope you're thinking about it. I hope you're able to watch and see and determine which one was different. So now I will show you that, in fact, the box that was different was the center middle box. Now, what's going on here? Well, because I showed it to you fairly quickly, you did not really have time to read them. And we have different aspects of vision. So we have center vision, which is where we read words. And then we have a variety of different kinds of peripheral vision. But outside of center vision in general is that peripheral vision, which is where we detect little differences. And so the process of reading and taking in a bunch of visual information, or the process of scanning a sports field and taking in a bunch of information, or driving a car and being able to have a good view of what's going on the roads around us, all of these involve visual span. And Mark seems to be particularly well versed in all of this. And of course, it comes in through our retina and transmits information to the visual cortex. But there are a bunch of parts of vision. And so the point here is that can actually determine, if you think about visual span, it could impact reading fluency, for example. And we'll talk about that in another minute. But just to make you aware of some of these processes. What could we do if a student didn't have sufficient visual span? Here, as many times as I've asked this question, it pretty much, but maybe Mark will have a thought here. Mostly we wouldn't even be aware of it. We might be aware that children are not as fluent readers or struggling with some aspects of reading and just not even be aware of it. So typically, if we did determine that, we might have them focus on different parts of it or visual training exercises, and those could be important as well. But that would actually help them develop those skills and develop improved visual span. So that would be very helpful, but it's something that's very hard to work around. So the last thing I want to do at this point is focus now on working memory, because if we don't have good working memory and the ability to rehearse information and elaborate it, connect it to what knowledge that we previously have gathered, we're going to have a lot of difficulty and we're not actually going to be able to then get it into long-term memory. So I have a different visual memory, working memory example than I sometimes use. And what's going to happen is we've got a little grid, and these little blocks in different colors are going to appear. So if we saw this one and then it disappeared, we would say red. Okay, so that was just one. Now I'm going to try it, and you're going to see colors appear in a few different boxes, and I want you to try and remember the colors and the order that they appear in. So here we go. Okay, so my guess is that if you were paying attention, that most of you could remember that it was red and purple and yellow and green. So that was a series of 4 things. Now we're going to try a little bit more challenging one. Red, purple, yellow, green. Great job. Everybody gets a pat on the back. Now let's try this one. Oops. Oh, so that, okay, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just showing that those were the correct ones. So here's another example. Okay, that was 9. And don't anybody stress out, because unless you are unusual and have pretty much photographic memory, most adults would not be able to name all of that whole sequence. So adults in general have a working memory capacity of about 7 chunks of information, plus or minus 2. And the reason I'm showing you this is not that I would expect you to be able to remember it. I couldn't. But in fact, that this is what it is like for many of our students who don't have enough working memory or sufficient working memory capacity. And in fact, what happens is that everything we expose them to, even the things that seem like they should be able to remember them, it seems like too much, and they simply can't hold that information in working memory. And very often then they just sort of give up. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to do that, so I'm just going to forget all of it. And of course, here were all of the colors, just to show you what they were. And I can't remember exactly the sequence, but they were all there. So what do we do now if we have a student who has limited working memory? What are some of the strategies that we might use? Because this is very common in students with learning disabilities, as well as students with ADHD and other cognitive challenges. So if they can't chunk and build, says Jane, absolutely. So if what we start to do is with a smaller bunch of information, remember that the working memory is about chunks of information. So if we can combine information into chunks, that's going to be helpful. Dave is mnemonics. Those are great both for long-term and for working memory. It's because while you're thinking about things in working memory, you can sort of go through your checklist of whether it's the Great Lakes home or whether it's something else. Additional practice. Of course, the more that we rehearse something in working memory, absolutely. And the other thing that we commonly do is we break it down. So if, for example, instead of giving a student a set of 3 instructions, we might just break it down and give them one at a time because we know that they are challenged to hold that information. I think the chunking and building is, and in fact, learning over time, what we do as we get older is we've connected information into chunks, like we had that experience a little bit earlier with sleep and all of the concepts that were connected to it. So we have these networks of information where we can call that network something as a chunk, things related to sleep, for example, and call that up. So we can actually manage things at a higher level with bigger chunks of information as we get older. So that's a really interesting comment from Natasha. So helping them work around, again, their working memory might have them write things down because they can't remember things. So those would be some of the typical ways that we help students who have working memory issues. So right now what I'm going to do, because we know how important working memory is to the learning process, what I'd like to do is spend just a minute or two having you pretend that you have a colleague, and maybe you are sitting with a colleague. If you're sitting with a colleague, absolutely do this together as you are talking to each other. Have one of the members, or if you're by yourself, you're going to have to do this. Think about what you've heard so far, what some of the main points are that you think are important, and pretend that your colleague has just come in and missed the first part of the webinar, or just take a moment and go back through your notes if you're taking notes, or just jot down the 2 or 3 concepts or points that were the most salient for you. Because the act of doing this helps us rehearse it in working memory. You're welcome to chat in the chat window if there's something you want to share, but the point is really this is for you. This is about strengthening and building the network, the neural network connections that you're making as part of this webinar. All right, absolutely, John. We are recording it, and we'll get automatically, everybody who's participating will get a link to the recorded webinar. When it's available, it usually is available later the same day or certainly within 24 hours. So you can check back if you don't, but you should get an automated email. All right, so I hope you've actually taken advantage of the opportunity to exercise some of that working memory and to get some of those concepts maybe a little more firmly connected to your prior knowledge so that it will be easier to remember them in the longer term. So what I want to do now is we've looked at some skills. We've looked at some sensory memory. We've looked at attention. We've looked at working memory. But obviously, there are some other things going on here. And this is a chart that we use to talk about sort of how all of these skills relate to each other and to sort of try to make some sense of them and to think about all of the areas that our students may need support in as part of the learning process. So what we have in this chart is up at the very top are all of the reasons we do what we do, whether we're a parent or whether we're trying to work so hard for our students, is that eventually we want them to get as far as they can academically. We want them to do well. and that's an important part of their having a good job that they find satisfying and that will support them and their families. We want them to be healthy. We want them to stay out of jail, and all of those kinds of things. And seems like today can be pretty complicated sometimes. And under that, of course, are the things that we tend to focus on, and that most educators, at least in the K-12 arena, are measured by is our children's ability to learn to read and to do math. And of course, technology is another important part of that. So in there we have defined other skills, phonics, decoding, fluency. In terms of numeracy skills, our number sense, our operation sense, computation, technology skills, digital media and the importance of social media today, productivity tools, programming, systems thinking. And so we sort of understand that those are all part of either reading or math or technology, and probably cut across some of those. But there's an infrastructure of cognitive ability, cognitive capacity, if you will, that sits underneath all of this. And it starts down at the bottom with, let's see if I can do that, with this box, and it's pretty small, but you'll be able to read it in the handout, of what we refer to as foundational cognitive skills. So these are a bunch of those processes that some of which we referred to earlier. So all of our attention skills would sit in this box. Our visual processing skills, visualization, directionality, our processing speed, our timing, our ability to pace ourselves, simultaneous and sequential processing. So these are all the basic ways that we get information into our brains from the outside world. And if they're all working efficiently and accurately, that is great, and we'll get that information into our brains to start the learning process. But as we saw before, if our attention skills aren't good, if our visual processing isn't good, that can create some hiccups, and we will see then students who are struggling. Now, most of these things happen non-consciously and in fractions of a second. So they're not the kinds of things that are amenable to, in general, to direct instruction. And we'll come back to the whole concept that Ashley mentioned earlier. I think she was talking about training, which is a little bit different. But I pretty much want to just emphasize here that these are skills. So, for example, if I say pay attention, that does nothing to improve a student's attention skills. If they have issues with visual processing, again, that's not something where I can explain to somebody, for example, how to have better visual span. Now, I may be able to train it, and we're going to get back to that in a little bit. But that's one of the issues with these skills, and I think why we don't pay attention to them as much as we should, perhaps, as educators, because they're not things that we can instruct. Now, on top of that are a group of cognitive skills that are now being referred to as executive functions. And most educators I find today have heard this term and are familiar in general with the concept. And that is great, because these are highly correlated with academic performance. In fact, executive functions are very highly correlated with everything at the very top. So including whether you're going to end up in jail, what your long-term health outcomes are, how much money you're going to make in your lifetime. So these are really, really important, and they're critical, and we'll get into this in a little bit more depth in just a minute. But there are three core executive functions. Working memory, which we've already talked about, so hopefully you all have a good sense of what that's all about, the ability to hold that information in your mind. Inhibitory control, pretty much what it sounds like. So this is when you are able to stop yourself from punching someone in the nose when they make you really angry. Or the other example that I often give is, which is the opposite of having good inhibitory control, which is when you have a child at a birthday party sitting next to the birthday boy or girl, and the cake comes in, and the guest, not the birthday boy or girl, can't hold themselves back and blows out all the candles. So it's those kinds of things, but it's also, in the longer term, being able to defer gratification. So it's that instantaneous, but it's also can operate over a period of time. And then the third core executive function is cognitive flexibility. So that's our ability to shift our mindset when the rules of the world around us change. So which is really the essence of learning a lot of things. So we may learn things in a very simplified way, and then we have to refine our thinking as we get more information and have a more solid understanding of some of the nuances. Or we know from the context how to behave differently. We might shift the way that we think and the way that we behave when we're at home versus at school versus in the workplace versus, with a bunch of friends. And then on top of those core executive functions are the ones that we're now starting to be aware of, are ones that we talk about all the time. These are higher order executive functions, things like reasoning and problem solving and planning and critical thinking and collaboration and creativity. And of course, this reads a lot like 21st century skills, so we're putting more emphasis, or the fact that whether you're using Common Core or some other version of standards, typically there is more emphasis these days on the importance of developing these higher order executive functions, or even just the top of Bloom's taxonomy or whatever. So a lot of emphasis on this, although we may not know exactly what to do about it. And what we're showing here is that all of these sit underneath the reading and math and technology and everything else that relies on those, what we sometimes refer to as the basics, which are clearly not just the basics, because all of these underlying skills are necessary in the learning process. And what we're going to do is just spend a few minutes exploring that a little bit more. Making the point finally before we leave the slide, I guess, is that we as teachers often get asked to teach reading, teach math, teach technology, teach all the other social studies and science and everything else that resides on those basic skills without knowing whether this cognitive infrastructure is in place. And so we can actually take a look at that, and as we've seen, can play a pretty important role. So I want to just look at reading and math just in a little bit more depth. If I ask most educators what the basics of reading are, I will typically hear something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And indeed, those are important skills. We cannot be good readers without them. But they're also not the most basic. There is, in fact, no decoding part of our brain. In fact, we build connections among parts of our brain that we co-opt actually to do the decoding process. And then we also have to add in other kinds of things like sustained attention, visual discrimination, auditory discrimination, all of these, keeping the words and the letters in the right order as they come into our brains. So all of these can impact the decoding process. When it comes to fluency, visual span. So we talked about that a little bit before. So if I can take in more information at a glance, I'm going to be able to probably read a little bit faster, a little more fluently. Flexible attention, how I shift my attention from one line to the next, also involves some ocular motor control, but my flexible attention, my processing speed. And then when it comes to comprehension, here's where the rubber really meets the road. Because we often find, and I hear teachers talking about this all the time, that they have students who have learned to decode and they can read fairly fluently, and they will read something and have no idea what they've read. And making that leap to comprehension is something that seems to require hope and prayer more often than a really solid understanding of what's going into the process. And here is where things like working memory are absolutely essential, and why those two are so highly correlated. So if I'm reading a text, I'm keeping track of several pieces of information. That happens in working memory. It's our only conscious processing. So if I have limited working memory, or it's being taken up with decoding, I'm going to be able to hold on to less information. If I encounter a word or a concept I don't understand, and I have to go ask somebody about it or look it up or think about it, my ability to then still be holding that other information in working memory and bring that new concept back in and feed that in, again, that's going to be happening in working memory. And then the whole time, if I'm connecting the information I'm reading to what I already know, when I'm doing that consciously, that also happens in working memory. And of course, that's the essence of meaning. We have to be able to connect it to prior knowledge in order to be able to do that. When we're doing that consciously, that's in working memory, or creating a visual representation of something we are in visualization. So all these skills are actually critical, not just alongside reading, but as part of the learning to read process. And the same principles apply in math. So spatial representations are very, very important. In fact, there's a ton of very recent research that is starting to look at the role of visual spatial processing in mathematics in general. And it turns out that it's not just connecting. I mean, we can logically connect this to things like geometry, or extracting information from charts or graphs, or looking at a schematic, or reading a map and things like that. But in fact, it is highly related, as it turns out, to everything, just about all kinds of mathematical thinking, everything from simple counting to algebra and calculus. So that's been pretty fascinating new research to read about. Information manipulation, of course, there's a lot of reading and writing, in fact, in math these days. I used to refer to these when I was growing up as story problems, as opposed to just solving equations. But in fact, everything in math today is a story problem, because everything is about being able to apply it to real-world situations. So, of course, working memory, sequential processing, keeping track of where you are in a series of steps to solve something, selective attention, focusing on the right aspects of the problem that you're dealing with. And then ultimately, math is very logical. So planning, reasoning, logic, inference are all going to be important parts of math. And so, of course, some of these things are the same skills that we identified in reading that are also important in math, and vice versa. But we don't have two brains. Sometimes I wish I did, but we have one brain, and it uses all of these skills in lots of ways and combinations in order to do it. Now, one of the things that we know is that as we develop skills, and drive them to the level of automaticity, it becomes easier, and those skills are just there for us. And sometimes, I don't know if you all have this experience, but I sure have seen it a lot. And that is when you have students who may have weaker areas of cognitive processing, whether it's attention or working memory or visual processing or processing speed, whatever it happens to be, that whole pyramid, it can come in anywhere. And often I see them after they've been doing a set of problems or something that they're just exhausted. And I'm sure you've seen this. In fact, more exhausted, more tired than their peers who may still be brimming with energy, but it just takes a lot out of them. And this is a picture that sort of, I think, is a good representation of why. So what you're hearing, these are functional MRI scans. And so they are looking at the brain. This is from the top down, and looking at the areas that are the most active while you're doing a certain activity. The areas in red are the areas of the most activity, then yellow, and then the areas that are blue and green and purple are areas of less activity in the brain. And it turns out that these are two young men, the same age, who are both playing the same video game. And of course, we can see more activation in one and less activation in the other. So the question is, which of these, now the difference between these two young men is that one is a very experienced video game player. He's played this video game many, many times. And the other is a novice. And so just think about it and guess which one is which. And if you can read that little tiny print, it'll tell you. But hopefully what you are realizing is that the one on the right is the expert and the one on the left is the novice. So the novice is actually using more energy to do exactly the same activity. Our brains consume about 10% of all of the energy that is used in our bodies. They're very expensive metabolic real estate, as I heard a neuroscientist say once. They consume a lot of energy. And and in fact, so it takes less energy once we become really good at something. And so if we see students who are just exhausted by the process of trying to learn something, this can help to explain why. Now, the next thing I want to do, actually, I'm going to slip over to do these in the reverse order. Everything that we were talking about before in terms of what to do with students who might have some deficits or some weaknesses in some of these cognitive processing areas, most of the suggestions, not all of them, I have to give credit to some of them, is it has to do with helping them compensate for, helping them work around. So typically we will find adjustments to the curriculum, or we'll do accommodations, or we will provide strategies and things like that. It also turns out that these cognitive processes can be enhanced. They can be developed through the right kind of training. It's sort of like going to the gym. You can build up muscle and flexibility and improve your tone and all of that kind of thing physically, but it turns out you can also do this mentally. So I believe it was Ashley before, for example, was talking about vision training for visual span, and that's absolutely right, and it's the same principle. So what you're seeing here is a study that was conducted. The cognitive training in this case was a program called BrainWare Safari. And what you're seeing there is the control group and the group that used BrainWare cognitive training over about 12 weeks. And the pre and the post test in this case was the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery. Those of you who are in special ed or some kind of related field are probably familiar with that test. It's a widely regarded, nationally normed, very reliable and scientifically valid test of a variety of different cognitive processes. And so the tests break down into some processing areas which connect right back to the things that we were talking about in terms of that cognitive infrastructure that's needed for learning. And here you can see these were students actually who were diagnosed as having a specific learning disability. And so by definition, we know they have some cognitive deficits, which are readily apparent here. So the scale here is on something called a relative proficiency index, and 90% is what is expected of a normally developing student. And so you can look across the board and see that these students in general were lower, sometimes really very significantly lower on average. Things like verbal working memory, and you can see that both the control group and the BrainWare group were very low, only about 50% proficiency on these tasks, where they should be at 90% if they were fully developed. So things like verbal working memory, short-term memory, attention skills, executive functions. And if you tested different students, you would get a different profile, and they would have different strengths and weaknesses. But this is one that's very common for this particular category of students. It also would probably be very similar looking for students with ADHD, who tend to have low working memory and attention skills and executive functions as well. So the other slide really looks at, bundles all of those cognitive skills together. And you can see that there was not much change for the control group, but really a dramatic change. And in fact, as you saw in the previous slide, getting these students up. In this case, it was on average 89% proficiency, which is very, very close to the 90% that's can be considered normally developing. And then you can see the impact that it had on reading and math. And in fact, this was 0.8 of a grade equivalent in reading and a full grade equivalent in math in just 12 weeks. So really underscores how vital these skills are to, there was, yeah, it was, you know, what we see typically is improvement in both reading and math, and there will be variations depending on the set of skills that are being involved. So it was a little bit less in reading in terms of grade equivalent growth, but you know, certainly a lot greater than would have been expected, and that was experienced by the control group. And we see this pretty regularly. So the point being that we can, as we start to think about these students, we've always worked very hard to try and adjust the curriculum to support their learning needs. We've provided accommodations, extra time, and those kinds of things, some of the things that you mentioned for students with attention issues. Compensatory strategies, you know, many of these can be useful for learners of any kind, but they're absolutely essential for kids who have learning issues. And we can add a fourth, so cognitive skills training, which can actually help to remediate some of these underlying cognitive challenges. So Yvonne is asking, would a child with these challenges be able to keep up with this intense training and other educational demands? Yes. In fact, these students were in a normal school environment. They used the program 30 to 45 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week for 12 weeks. So it's something that can be readily incorporated into a regular routine so that they're still, you know, keeping up with their classwork and being in their regular classrooms and things like that. So it's with the right kind of training that's very, it's comprehensive, it's highly integrated, it's got progressive challenges and all these things. So this kind of work actually has been going on in a clinical environment for probably 50, 60 years now. But recently the technology has evolved that this kind of training can actually be delivered to a group of individuals, not just one-on-one, via the computer. So, another great question is about the improvements and whether they last. So a couple different ways to answer this. We don't have yet really long longitudinal work on this, which of course we're working on and would like to see, and that's terribly important. We have done tests 6 months or a year after the students stopped using the program, and in fact they continued to they maintained their gains, or in some cases they actually continued to develop at an accelerated rate. And essentially what we're trying to do here is drive these skills to the level of automaticity. You know, we talked about how much less energy our brains use when we have those skills at an automatic level. And that's what we're trying to do. And once they're there, it's sort of like riding a bike or learning to tie your shoes or driving a car. Once you learn that skill and it's automatic at the procedural level, then it's just there for you to use. Now, if you're in an environment like school, you're typically going to be calling on those skills all the time. So you're going to be asked to be paying attention. You're going to be asked to hold things in working memory while you're doing problem solving, all of those kinds of things. And so you're going to generally retain them. If you're looking at this kind of training as an older adult, and you're not in a, currently in a work environment where you're going to be called on to use those skills all the time, you might need to continue the training. So it's sort of situation dependent. And of course, there is always use it or lose it. And so if we're using them, we're going to tend to keep them. And is there really a chat limit? I did not know that. All right, I'm going to have to look into that, but I appreciate knowing that. So that's sort of the long version, I guess. So we have about 5 minutes left, so that's great. And I want to see, I'm going to go back, scroll back to the chat to see if there are any questions that I've missed along the way. And encourage you to enter any additional questions you might have into the chat window. Okay. Yeah, I love the fact that everybody was looking for evidence of stored memory, the ability to actually retrieve it, which is, of course, what we need to do. We can't properly be said to have learned anything if we can't actually summon that information back up and use it and apply it. All right, scrolling, seeing a question about emotions. And yes, emotions are very powerful, either motivators or impediments to learning. And so, for example, if we are in a very threatening environment, all of our, basically we go into fight or flight mode, which actually shuts down cognition and we are not able to think. So if you're in a physically threatening or even an emotionally threatening environment, learning is certainly going to be impaired. On the other hand, emotion creates stronger memory traces. So positive emotions are actually an important part of learning. And so if we can create really strong positive connections for learning, that can help. It's very important aspect of learning. I'm glad you asked that and underscored that. I love these comments. You guys are really know what you're talking about, and that's wonderful. All right, let me go. Training. Middle school students' attitude towards the training. So most middle schools, it's actually in a video game format, and most students get very involved in it, and they want to beat the game, and they become a little bit competitive with each other. So they actually typically really welcome it, and so teachers to start working on cognitive training skills. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about this particular approach to cognitive training, we do have a lot of information on our website, as well as invite you to suggest a time when we could do a demonstration. We can go a little bit more deeply into the research and the kinds of students it's been used with and actually how it works. But it's really quite easy to implement. Autism spectrum and executive functioning. Yes, I think they are different. I think there certainly could be overlapping. There's a lot of comorbidity with all of these, between ADHD and learning disabilities and all that kind of thing. But they're different. The autism spectrum typically has some anomalies in the social interaction part of the brain. And I'm not an expert, but I would say that they probably overlap. Okay. Yes, the recording will be posted. It will be on the Big Marker site. So if you just click back on the link that you used to join the webinar, it'll bring you back here. Or you'll be getting a link directly to it once it's posted. Actually, good question about cognitive training, and is it only for those who have been identified with cognitive deficits? What I will tell you is that we all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and probably everybody on this webinar has figured out how to compensate for their weaknesses. My weaknesses are largely visual. I did vision training when I was a little girl, and I had some definite visual processing issues. But I know that they can get stronger. We all have areas I have some colleagues whose directionality, that instantaneous knowing left and right is not as strong. That can be developed. Working memory can be developed. And so we actually have situations where we've worked with students who have qualified at higher rates for gifted programs, who have even improved scores on ACTs, high-performing students. So it can be, it's really, if you ask the question, is who's physical training for, we would say everybody. I think that cognitive training is starting to become something that we're much more aware of, our brain health, keeping our brains fit and active, and understanding what's involved in that. So things that are challenging, developing in an integrated way, all of these skills, all of those are really important aspects of what we now understand to be effective training. Okay, so, oops, I run a minute over. I didn't mean to keep you past the time. I want to thank everybody so much for your time today. Time is the scarcest thing we have and a great gift, and we really appreciate your spending some time with us. If there's anything that I can help with or that anybody here at BrainWare can help with, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to continue the conversation and support you in any way that we can. So thank you again, and we hope to see you at another webinar sometime in the near future. We'll be scheduling some more pretty shortly, and thanks again, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.